What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about the latest film coming from Lionsgate and Blumhouse, and that movie is called Imaginary. Directed by Jeff Wadlow, who wrote this film alongside Greg Erb and Jason Oremland. This film stars people like DeWanda, Taegen Burns, Pyper Braun, Petty Buckley, Tom Payne, and more. Hey guys, and welcome to my review for Imaginary. This is the movie that I started to see the trailers for over the course of months and months and months, and was pretty interested to check it out. I like the idea of a imaginary friend turned evil, and the concept of the trailer seemed pretty fun at least. Blumhouse is a mixed bag when it comes to them as a studio because they can put out some top tier horror that can really surprise audiences, even if it's something silly like Megan that just kind of became a cultural thing at the time. After seeing that movie last year, I was like, yeah, this is definitely going to be at Halloween Horror Nights, and then that's exactly what ended up happening. And so here we are now with their latest film that is a collaboration with Lionsgate, and it's pretty straightforward when it comes to the premise, and so let's touch on what the premise is all about. But before I do that, I do want to mention that since it's a new movie and a lot of you guys are probably watching this wondering if it's any good, the trailers have pretty much spoiled everything about this movie, especially some of the more like recent little teasers and like little adverts that I'd see on YouTube and various other places. They're spoiling so much about this movie visually, and it's so easy to tell where this movie's gonna go. And as somebody who saw the trailers for this movie theatrically over and over and over again over the course of months, I went in with almost little to no surprises as to what to expect from this film. And so that's definitely a downside on the marketing. However, with that said, I'm just going to at least touch on what this movie is about without giving away everything that the trailers give away. But I just wanted to say that right out of the gate because if you've seen the trailers, you probably pretty much know everything that there is to know for the most part about this movie. The movie opens up when we're introduced to Jessica, played by DeWanda, and her family are now moving into her childhood home. I won't give you any of the details as to why in particular, but she has left that childhood home when she was a really young girl, and so it's been a long time. She doesn't necessarily remember everything that happened in that childhood home. She just knows that there was a very particular reason that she had to leave at a certain point, but that's kind of shrouded in some ambiguity. Now, she's kind of the new stepmom in this situation where her husband is a musician. He goes away on a tour, and so she's left behind now with her two stepdaughters, a younger one who seems to be taking a little bit more of a liking to her, and one who's a little bit older who isn't necessarily taking a liking to her. And those two actresses are Taegen Burns and Pyper Braun. Now, the majority of the film focuses on Jessica, but the main other character that we focus on here is the character of Alice, the youngest of her two stepdaughters, who now has a new imaginary friend by the name of Chauncey, who is in the form of a small stuffed teddy bear. And as the movie progresses, we start to learn that Chauncey, this stuffed teddy bear imaginary friend, actually may have some history with Jessica from her past living in that home. I'll leave it at that, but the base premise of this film beyond that is an imaginary friend gone evil, gone rogue, however you want to look at it. This little girl now has an imaginary friend that she should not be friends with. And I'm sure that premise sounds pretty familiar to a lot of people. We've seen things like that in countless horror films. The young kid in the family is able to talk to some sort of entity, whether it be through an imaginary friend or some other means throughout the course of the film. And in the case of this film, most of it is just brushed off as cute innocence, a young girl having an imaginary friend. But of course, things start to get a little bit weird. Some weird occurrences start to happen. Some creepy things start to happen. And while those things are being brushed off here and there, it ultimately leads the rest of the characters to recognizing that something needs to be done, which leads to a big third act situation where they have to fend themselves off from this entity. To be completely honest, you've seen this movie countless times, and it's one of those classic things similar to the movie Night Swim from earlier this year, where the family moves into a house, there's some sort of entity there. At some point in the film, they reach out to somebody who has some sort of history or knowledge of the events that take place in the house that kind of enlightens them on what to do and how to handle their situation, and then you go from there. And honestly, Imaginary is pretty much just that. It's a very straightforward, generic horror film that is filled with every single horror movie trope that is in the book. If you've seen horror films, if you're well versed in horror like I am, then there is no doubt in my mind that you're going to watch this movie and think that you've seen this movie countless times. Now, I want to be clear about something. I didn't hate this movie, but I definitely didn't love it, nor did I really think it was all that great. But I don't think the film is terrible either. I think DeWanda Wise, who plays Jessica, our main character in the film, is giving a solid performance throughout the course of the film, and I would also say that I think majority of the performances throughout the course of the film are pretty solid. Where this film does kind of do the actors dirty, though, is in its script, where I found that most of the dialogue and a lot of the character choices were rather annoying, pretty dumb, or just flat out obnoxious, especially when it came to the teenagers and the young kids who are present in this story. A lot of the other characters are also relegated to exposition-heavy characters that are just kind of there to tell us something to get the story moving. And I think majority of the weight of this movie's script is really on DeWanda Wise as Jessica, and I do think she gives a good performance. Outside of that, the film is also well shot, well lit throughout the course of the film, and utilizes some pretty solid practical effects and makeup, and most notably some big animatronic costuming in the third act of this film that I actually really enjoyed. There's also some really solid production design that you can see specifically in the third act of this film, and as the movie was coming to a close and there was a lot of stuff going on in that third act, I instantly saw in my mind that this is without a doubt going to be part of the Blumhouse experience that they typically have at Halloween Horror Nights at Universal Studios. I can already see segments of this movie being part of the haunted mansion, the haunted maze that you'll have to go through at Halloween Horror Nights. And on one hand, I kind of enjoyed that. There's a goofiness to this film, and there's part of the aesthetics of this film and the premise that I did actually quite enjoy. But where this movie really fell flat for me was just overall in its execution. What sounds like a pretty solid premise in some ways, though it is a little bit generic, ultimately just was executed in the most generic way. You already have a premise that is somewhat generic, but also somewhat kind of unique and has its own identity, and then you literally fill the film with just your generic jump scares, the generic moments of the entity standing behind somebody, they turn around, it's gone, then some sort of fake out jump scare. There's just so many moments in this film that ultimately feel like a rinse and repeat of every other just generic horror film that you can find on a streaming service or that's just come out in theaters in the last 2 decades. And so on that level, Imaginary just kind of gets lost in the shuffle. Now, I did say that it has its own identity in a lot of ways, and it does, but ultimately by the time I got to the end of the film, I just don't think that the film ever does anything with the part of it that does feel unique enough to really make it something that's worth watching again, or even worth going to your friends and being like, hey, you should definitely check out Imaginary. This isn't a film I can give a ringing endorsement to, nor is it a film that I necessarily can say was flat out terrible and that you'll have a horrible time with it, because I was entertained enough with it. Now, one thing that I don't necessarily know if it was intentional when it comes to this film is that, of course, the premise is goofy, and so there are elements of this film that are a little bit funny. There was a couple of moments that I did laugh that felt like intentional moments for the audience to laugh, but there was also way more moments in this film that were, I feel, unintentionally hilarious, where the audience that I saw it with, which was pretty packed out theater, were all laughing at a bunch of different moments throughout the course of this movie that I don't necessarily know were meant to be funny. There were moments that I think were meant to be played serious that were ultimately making tons of the people in the audience laugh, and I couldn't help but follow suit because some of these moments were just so stupid and so ridiculous. At the end of the day, Imaginary has some solid ideas and some solid performances and some solid filmmaking to boot with all of that I've already mentioned. But unfortunately, the solid premise and those other filmmaking elements and the performances just didn't save this from being just another run-of-the-mill horror film that's coming from Blumhouse. And again, they're a really interesting studio because sometimes they can give us top-tier horror and sometimes they can give us just generic, just garbage that we've already seen time and time again. And I don't necessarily know that I think this movie's garbage. I was entertained enough. I do see the potential of this film, but by the time it was over, I just felt like just another generic horror film that I think will do well with preteens and teens and maybe some people who are trying to get into horror. This is definitely horror light, so to speak. But yeah, the movie just didn't have enough to really latch me in and make me want to tell you guys to rush to the theaters and go and check it out. So, with all that said, Imaginary, are you planning on checking it out? Did you already check it out? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.